Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters on Armstrong Cable. Chapters is the television program that profiles local authors, editors, and publishers in our community. I'm Elliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. Our episode this time comes to you from Empire Books and News at Pullman Square in downtown Huntington, and we are pleased to have writer Rosalie Ash with us today. And Rosalie Ash is retired from a career as a probation tech with the U.S. District Court here in Huntington, West Virginia. She's also a former weekly newspaper columnist. She's won awards for humorous writing from West Virginia Writers Incorporated and the Most Like Irma Bombeck contest. And she's also a former television writer, having worked in television writing and that medium back in the 1960s. And the title of her book that we're going to be talking about today is called We Fought Back, How a Grassroots Group Defeated Annexation and Eminent Domain. And Rosalie, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for being on Chapters. I love this story. This is a story, as we were talking about before we started taping, that I think a lot of people don't know much about, even people that were living in Huntington in this area at the time. So give us a little bit of background about what's going on in your book and what led up to some of the things that you write about in your book.
Well, we got up one morning, picked up the newspaper, and on the front page was the story that the city of Huntington planned to, by eminent domain and annexation, take over our entire community, which pretty much stretched all the way to the Mason County line from the Huntington City line. And it got a lot of us upset, and we got together, 8 of us, and started talking about it and decided we needed to have a community meeting. And we got on the phone and we started calling people. Each one of us called 10 people and had them call 10 people. So when we had the meeting that night, we weren't prepared. We had it at the fire department, and we had an overflow crowd. And it went from there. I mean, it just boomeranged. We just kept having the meetings and finding out more and more and fighting the city to stop them from taking over our homes. They tried annexing the river and failed on that, and they finally gave up on annexing the highway. But we had quite a ride for the year and a half that we were doing this. Many of the people helped with different committees. They had petitions. We went to city council meetings. We pretty much interrupted them or disrupted them. I mean, when you have 100 people from a community show up at a city council meeting and they're all angry, then it's pretty disrupting. We got the city council divided. A couple of them actually ended up in pretty much a fist fight out in the hallway one night over it.
Oh my!
It was quite a story, and it even got down to the point when we were talking about incorporating to avoid this, that we got a call that someone was planning to kidnap our son, who was about 8 years old at the time. And then one of the other leaders got a phone call that he owned a grocery store, and someone was going to come in with a shotgun and shoot everybody in his store. So it really got pretty nasty. But in the very end, we won. Mm-hmm. The city had to give up. And as a result of that, the city ended up doing away with the city manager form of government. They fired the city manager, and we never heard anything more from them after that.
And this was around the mid-1980s, is that correct?
It was 1979, 1980.
Okay.
Right in that time period. But we even tried to incorporate the area as a town. Mm-hmm. But the county commission turned us down on that one. Okay. They had objections from the city that we were not actually, we didn't qualify as a town. Mm-hmm. Because we didn't have enough businesses and we had some open space. Mm-hmm. But we gave it a try.
And let me ask you a little bit about what the city of Huntington was wanting to do. They were wanting to build a monolithic river port.
Right.
Let me ask you, first of all, what is that for our audience who may not know that? Okay. And why did they pick your neighborhood, and why did they pick 1979, 1980 to do this? What was the reason to have it done then and right now?
The city was on the verge of bankruptcy, as it has been for many years, and it was to get money. They thought they could build this riverport and make millions of dollars off of it. They intended to take what is now the Kennedy Center. At that time, it was the Glenbrier. And they were going to put 10 million tons of coal in there to store. They were going to have barge mooring facilities all up and down the Ohio River. They were going to have, right where the Riviera Golf Course is, it was going to be a tank farm to store chemicals. Plus, they were going to have tank farms over by the river to store chemicals. Mm-hmm. And they would also store them in the barges and so forth. And we just felt, that being right behind the elementary school and right across from the junior high school at the time, that it was a very poor idea. It was very dangerous. Mm-hmm. And not only that, we felt that probably the school would end up closing because there wouldn't be anybody left in the neighborhood, because they intended to take probably a couple hundred homes in the area. And we just couldn't allow it to happen.
I wanted to ask you too about this conflict that you had with the city of Huntington. You mentioned that eventually the city council was divided, and you had a couple of city councilmen getting into fisticuffs out in the hallway out by council chambers.
I think I titled that "The Circus" or something.
Yes,
like that.
Yes, that was titled "The Circus." Absolutely. Before it got to that point, though, when you first started and your organization and your groups first started pushing back against the city's idea, did they take you seriously? What was kind of their reaction? I know you touch on that a little bit in the book. How did they just kind of dismiss you in the beginning?
I think they did dismiss us in the beginning. They thought, well, it's just a bunch of crazy people, and they won't be able to do anything. But I think they didn't really comprehend what we could do. When you get a group that sticks together, you can accomplish a lot. I don't think a couple of the city councilmen, well, one of them actually said, well, we don't care anything about those people. And when he ran for sheriff, he got defeated because we worked against him. Mm-hmm. But you can't discount that many people. The city manager, I don't think he really thought we would do anything. Mm-hmm. We showed up at one meeting when they had this Draveau Corporation come in who were going to design this facility. And we all showed up, and it turned out to be a real mess for them, because we showed up, we objected, we took their books. They had these notebooks with the design in it, and we all went up and got us a copy. They didn't have any left for the city councilman or the city manager. They didn't like that. They had planned a wine and dine meeting afterwards, and that kind of blew up in their faces because some of the councilmen refused to go. Mm-hmm. And it became public knowledge, and they didn't like that. And they couldn't understand how I was getting this information ahead of the fact. I always knew what was going on that wasn't released. Right. But I had people who were in City Hall and other various places who were getting the information for me. And there was one who was actually going through the trash to get information.
Yeah. And some of that comes from your journalism training, too.
Right.
And having sources and working those sources, so to speak, and maintaining those connections and those contacts. I wanted to ask you something else that I found so interesting in your book about this monolithic riverport. This actually was not only just sort of a Huntington issue, but at some time, and you talk about this in the book, there was discussion about maybe moving that over to Chesapeake, and some of the residents over in the Chesapeake Sims Creek area were going to be targets of this riverport, and they kind of pushed back also. What were their responses, and did they sort of cross the bridge, so to speak, and join with you all in trying to push back?
They didn't actually join with us. They came to a few of our meetings to learn what we were doing, and on their own, they went against the city. They filed their objections and everything. We kind of worked together on it, but not jointly.
Okay. I want to ask you, too, making a connection from this event in the late 70s, early 80s to a discussion that was had and has been had over and over here in Huntington, over in the Westmoreland area, about putting a barge dock, for lack of a better description. I know it has a different term, but lining up barges and using those barges as storage facilities in the Westmoreland area. Do you see similarities between your experience and that? Because we know there's been a lot of pushback against the city for that, and a lot of the residents and businesses there say, we don't want those barges tied up next to the river.
They actually started that back in the late 70s. And we had a couple of the people from Westmoreland who came to our meetings and learned what we were doing. And so over the years, they've tried to use some of those same tactics to push back against the city. So, I mean, we had a lot of people from a lot of places.
Yeah. A lot of participation, it sounds like, too. And you do such a great job of talking about that in your book. I wanted to ask you, too, about how you composed this book, because mentioning that you've got a journalism background and that you've written newspaper columns, one of the things I found so interesting and engaging about the book is that it was written like a longer expose that you would see, in the Sunday paper, the feature story on the front page, where it's broken up with headings and subheadings throughout the book. Is that something that you decided to do when you sat down to write the draft, or as you were just trying to tell the story, just sort of worked that way? How did you choose that style?
That came late in the writing. When I first sat down to write it, I started writing chapters, and then putting those chapters in order and together, and then came the headings and the subheadings and all that. Those were just before it was published. We actually sat down and did that. But I didn't even write the chapters in the order they are in the book. I wrote them in a different order. And when I got ready to put it all together, I discovered there was one important chapter I'd actually left out. So I had to go back and write it and put it in.
What did you find? And this book came out in 2006, is that correct?
2010.
Excuse me, 2010. And so you had quite a bit of time had passed between the actual events and the time that you started writing. Did that present any challenges for you in terms of trying to recall how the sequence of events went and who said what to whom throughout that whole process?
No, actually, we had moved a couple of times, and my husband went out in the garage, and he came in with this huge box of files and notes and all this stuff that I had saved over the years. And he brought them in, and he said, I know you're talking about writing a book. He says, here's what you can write on. And so there we had everything we ever had concerning our meetings and all the newspaper clippings, everything. It was right there in that box.
Oh, that's great. So you literally had the sort of the treasure trove right there in your garage.
I just had to organize all of it and put it together and then sit down and write.
When this book came out in 2010, for those politicians, political leaders that maybe were still in the area during that time, did you get any initial pushback? Anybody that was involved in the book, did anybody say, well, I didn't say that, or that's not exactly how it happened?
Did not hear one word from any of them. And I even invited some of them to my launch party that they didn't show up.
Wow.
But no, I never heard a thing from any of them.
Interesting. That's really interesting. I know sometimes we've had other writers who write memoir, and they say that that is always a challenge when you're writing in that genre. Is that when you're writing about real people or real things or real conversations that were held, someone will step up and say, "Well, I didn't exactly say that," or "I didn't mean it the way that you wrote it," or "I didn't look that way exactly like you."
Well, even some of the people that are mentioned in there, I thought, well, I'm going to hear from them, but I didn't.
Interesting. So here we are today, and we see lots of times people have disagreements with their elected officials, and they want to challenge or want to push back or voice their displeasure. Now we email and Facebook our displeasure too, and we message board and do all these things. But when you look at that and you look at engaging your civic leaders and writing about it, why is it important? Why do you think that, or what's the lasting message from your book in terms of why should we keep a close eye on what our elected officials are doing?
Because they sometimes try to take advantage of people, and thinking that people won't say anything or do anything. And it's possible to fight back to City Hall. We proved that. And it was possible then, and it's possible today.
One of the things that also I found was interesting in your book is that Cabell County also got involved. You mentioned the county commission
Right.
earlier.
Oh, we ended up getting the state involved before it was over with.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that, because you sort of mentioned that in the book too. I found it
Well,
interesting.
I knew that the state owned the rivers, and they kept wanting to annex the river. Well, in order to do that, they needed state permission to do it. So we contacted the state and requested that they turn it down. And they turned down their request to annex the Wyandotte River and the Ohio River as a result of that.
And what kind of impact did you get from the media? What was their response, both, the newspaper media, the television media at that time? Of course, television media was still up and coming, but, print media still dominated
Right.
in many ways. What was their reaction to what you were doing? What were some of the comments and stories and things that they did on you all for your
One
actions?
television station actually showed up in my office and had things set up, cameras and everything, before I got to work one morning. One of the men had let them in, and it kind of shocked me. I was like, what are they doing here? But there were two television stations that took an interest in it, and they showed up for just about every meeting. They showed up for anything we did. They were there. They were constantly after me for interviews. Then there were the radio stations, and there were a couple of people who've actually gone on to become one who's a CNN reporter now. He showed up at our meetings and worked with us, and he was good with it. But the newspaper, they were good to publish everything that was going on, and some of the editorials supported us. So we had a lot of support. Now, one television station wasn't very supportive. They were more supportive of the city. But that was all right because we had the others.
So can you give us, from your memory, and I know you talk about this some in the book, who some of the players were at the time? You mentioned that was toward the tail end of Huntington's city manager form of government. Who was the mayor then? Who was city manager then? And how long had they been in office prior to this issue with your organization?
Oh, that's kind of hard to remember. But at the time, I believe Harold Frankel was the mayor. And then I think right after that, Bob Bailey became the mayor. Both of them were in mayor at that time, at various times. Some of the people who were council members was George Malott, Dean Sturm. There was a lady, Phyllis. I'm trying to remember. It's kind of hard to remember all those without looking at it.
Sure, I understand.
But there were quite a few of them. And we had most of the city council agreeing with us. It was pretty much split,
Mm-hmm.
but the ones who were agreeing with us were the most vocal. But it was Dean Sturm and Harold Frankel who got into the sort of fisticuffs in the hallway because they were upset, and George Malott was also involved in it.
Okay.
But it turned out to be quite an interesting experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I got involved in it because I showed up. I worked for one of the attorneys, and they wanted an attorney there, and I brought him that night. And when I showed up with the attorney to help us out that first night, I ended up being selected as the person to head it all up. And I was like, I'm not a leader, folks. But we got through it.
That's great. You mentioned the city council eventually being split. Was that something that evolved over time? I mean, in other words, when this whole issue first started and you guys started pushing back, was it pretty much 10-0 that the council wanted to do this, or were there always some people on the fence and you just kind of pushed that 5 over to your side?
There were some who were always on the fence, and it was very political. They just did not agree. You had Democrats and Republicans pretty much against each other. And they just never agreed on it.
Anything that you and your group did during that time in the pushback process that you wish you all would have done differently?
Probably on the incorporation, I think we would have approached it a little differently because people really didn't understand. And it was like a last-ditch effort. But when we started that's when the city really just finally threw up their hands and said, okay, we quit.
They just almost had enough.
I think they'd
taken
had
them
enough.
12
They
rounds.
had seen us enough.
Sure, I understand that totally. I wanted to ask you also, I love this quote. This is towards the end of your book. Huntington has the potential of being a great city if the politicians and citizens work together. Here we are, 2014, 30 plus years removed from what happened with your group and organization, and it seems like we still in many ways have problems with that relationship.
Right.
Why is it that we just can't seem to get our elected leaders and our citizenry on the same page when it comes to major issues like economic development, like annexation, like a lot of things that you talk about in your book? Why can we just still not get this right?
I think it's still political. Each political side, they will never agree to work together. They just can't do it.
Yeah. I want to ask you too, as we finish up in our closing moments, how long did it take you to write this? From the time you found that box in the attic, is it something you worked on every day, or did you have to go back and read all the notes and the entries first and then start writing? What was your process like? How long did it take you?
From the beginning to the publication, it was almost 2 years. It took me a while to organize everything, go through all the notes, put it all down into writing. I worked on it almost every night. I would usually start on about 9 o'clock after my husband would go to bed and work until around midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. And because it was nice and quiet then.
Yeah.
But it did take about 2 years.
Let me ask you too, is there anything that you're working on now? Any new projects you're working on, or anything that you're tackling, maybe memoir-wise or civic engagement-wise, or anything else you're working on?
I don't want to get in any more civic engagements.
You want some civic disengagement, in other words.
Right. I've been putting together some humorous stories that I've written over the years, some that have won in the West Virginia Writers humor category. And I'm trying to put some of those together and maybe put them into a book. But it's a process. I've been working on some other things.
Okay, very good. And final question as we finish up. If there's an organization out there, a group who's watching or who is restless with their elected officials about something, and they want to push back in some way, we could use that word very loosely because, as we talked about social media, and there's so many ways to get your voice out there and your message heard. Any advice you would give those groups who are thinking about sort of taking on their elected leaders? Any advice you'd give them, having been through that whole experience?
Number one is choose your fight carefully. Don't just fight to be fighting. And also, read the book. It's got a section in there on how to organize and how to plan and how to actually carry out a grassroots group.
Rosalie Ash, the title of her book is We Fought Back, How a Grassroots Group Defeated Annexation and Eminent Domain. A fantastic book, and I think everybody who lives in this region needs to read it because it's an important part of this area's past. And as we mentioned at the beginning, and as we mentioned before we started our interview today, it was something that I didn't know anything about, and I enjoyed it so much, and it's a very thought-provoking and a wonderful read, and we appreciate you coming in to talk about it today.
Okay, thank you.
And finally, we want to say a special thanks to our friends at Empire Books and News here at Pullman Square in downtown Huntington for providing our studio taping space today. And we invite you to stop by Empire Books and News for all of your reading needs. They have the Tri-State's largest selection of magazines and every genre of book that you're looking for to satisfy your reading need. That's right here at Empire Books and News. Talk to Charlotte and her friendly staff. They'll be able to help you find the book that you're looking for. And that's at Empire Books and News here at Pullman Square in downtown Huntington. We appreciate them so much for providing our studio taping space today. And lastly, if you have a comment, question, or suggestion about this chapter's program or any other chapter's program you've watched here on Armstrong Cable, we certainly want to hear from you. You can send us an email to the address at the bottom of the screen right there, lp4@zoominternet.net. That's how you can reach us right here on the show. And we appreciate those comments and feedback that we have received already. So if you have thoughts, comments, or suggestions, we certainly want to hear from you. So send those to us right at that email address, lp4@zoominternet.net. We promise we do read the emails and we do take your questions and suggestions seriously. So we appreciate what we've received so far, and please keep those comments coming. Well, that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters. Please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.